Welcome to a new episode of the Life Science Get Together podcast. Life-changing moments. There were two in my life. Basically, one was in September 2001. I'm pretty sure many people do remember that. It was 9/11. I remember it well because in those days I was studying for exams, and I was living with my girlfriend. We had an apartment. She was in the living room. I was in the other room. We were both studying, and she had the habit to have the television set on. And in a break, I walked to the living room, and the television set was on, and I saw this really horrible moment, which in a way was unreal. So my first thought was, is this a new movie? Is there something coming from Hollywood that I'm not aware of? And I thought, this is a really good trailer to a movie. And it took me a couple of minutes to realize it's not a movie, it's real life. And it was really horrible. The second life-changing moment that I realized was this year, was about January, February. I was digging into TikTok, social media, and there were suddenly these pictures from China that there is a new outbreak, a new virus. It also came to the newspapers in Austria. And I read amazing stories, so that the Chinese government built a hospital with 10,000 beds in 1 week. And I, as an Austrian European, thought, that's unbelievable. That's unreal. We can't do that in Europe. So, and I think everybody is aware of what I'm talking about. It's the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2. It happened in Q1 this year. And with these life-changing moments, I think it's quite normal that people try to understand what's going on. And especially with viruses, it's a little bit tricky because we tap into the field of science, and science is not easy. It's not black and white. It's complex. And we all know what's going on in Europe, but I lost a little bit track of the situation in China. When I opened the newspapers in Austria, I don't see much coverage about the Chinese situation. So I thought it's a good thing to invite one of my colleagues who happens to live in Shanghai, Irénée Robins, to the show and chat a little bit about the situation in China. Welcome to the show, Irénée.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Good to see you. Let's start first with the first question. Why are you the right person to talk to when it comes to the SARS-CoV-2 situation in China?
One of my life-changing moments was 25th of October 2000 when I arrived in China 20 years minus 1 month ago. On a one-way ticket, initially for a 3-year period, but now it's been extended by 17 years so far, and it's meant to continue probably. I've been in the medical field in China for almost 20 years now. In particular, I worked in the field of virology, immunology. I lived through the SARS outbreak, H1N1, H5N1, hand, foot, mouth disease, and now COVID. In particular, I had a posting during 6 years at Institut Pasteur in Shanghai, which gave me the opportunity to be very close to the research community, to be very close to public health authorities, and to be also very close progressively to the hospital sector. And given the fact that my role now and my work and my line of work over the past since I left Institut Pasteur, which was in 2011, my line of work is to support small and medium-sized innovating enterprises, innovating companies from Europe mostly, to enter the Chinese market in the healthcare sector, medical sector, medtech, biotech, etc. So to achieve such projects, I need to have multiple connections at multiple levels of the society here in China, which I can maintain. And so far, so good, let's say. I'm happen to be able to read, write, and speak the language, which helps a lot, of course. and I've been following up very, very closely the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 and its subsequent epidemic. I've been in Shanghai or in China continuously since last January without leaving the country at all. So I was as close as it gets to the action here and went through all the phases. So we're going to go through that certainly later on, but in a nutshell, that's one of the reasons. Those are the reasons why I believe I'm knowledgeable about the topic.
I know that you're knowledgeable about the topic. Good to see that you and your family are well and that you are all happy. I think when it comes to such changes in the world, of course, people show emotion. And with these emotions comes sometimes a little bit of, let's say, thinking in interesting ways, and there are a lot of theories on the market about SARS-CoV-2. So let's start with one theory that I read recently. The virus is fake. It doesn't exist. What's your opinion on that? Is SARS-CoV-2 really in the world, and is it alive?
Oh, I think we've seen enough peer-reviewed articles from many sources that show the virus itself via microscope, and we've seen obviously consequences on in hospital settings throughout the world of this new pathogen, and the cause consequence chain between the pathogen and what happened throughout the world has been clearly established. So the virus exists definitely. However, as many viruses do, it mutates. So we could probably say the viruses right now, because I'm pretty certain that there are many strains coexisting at the moment. It's strictly speaking, it's not alive. Strictly speaking, it's stable. A virus is not a living organism. It is stable. The colder, the stabler. The hotter, the less stable. And essentially, you've read whatever you've read saying that over a certain amount of minutes, 3 to 5 minutes above 70, 71 degrees Celsius, the virus degrades and is no longer a threat. And if you drop the temperature, the time lengthens, and if you go below 0 Celsius, now you can have a virus stability for months and maybe years as well. We'll come back to that because there are some interesting aspects in this, in how China dealt with the epidemic. But yes, it exists and it circulates.
I think to those who are not scientists, I think the best picture I saw in a movie, it was in 86 or 85, it was Tron. There was this movie from Hollywood. It was this time when computers became popular, and the story is about how a person is sucked into a computer, and this person starts living with programs, and there was this bit. So this was the smallest possible information, and it had either it was on or it was off, so it was binary. And I think what you describe is basically what the virus is: either it's on or it's off. It's doing something or it's doing nothing. Trying to put it simple, which is very difficult with science. Let's speak a little bit about the origin of the virus. When I think back to January, February, it looked like the virus originated in China, in the Wuhan province. And then from February onwards, it spread the world. This is the picture I get in the newspapers in Europe. What's the picture in China about the origin of the virus?
It's a very good question. Obviously, there are some aspects to answering this question that may delve into the way the country is managed in China on a political level. I personally do not want to go too deep into politics because there is a lot of unknown into this and a lot of speculation that can happen. But what we can be fairly certain about is that the initial circulations can date back to 2019 and more specifically to October. So the Wuhan market patient 0 is probably not strictly speaking the patient 0. It's probably it's patient above 0. There were probably people before that. When it comes to the transmission from bats to humans, highly probable so far. I have seen nothing absolutely compelling that would make me believe that this virus was engineered. Although it is true, again, facts only today, it is true that researchers in China and elsewhere in the world work on coronaviruses, work on bat viruses and manipulate them genetically. And they do this in various settings. We've heard things about P4 laboratories. Quick word on this, coronaviruses, I worked on P3, not on P4. Mm-hmm. So anything you read on P4 is probably baseless. But P3 laboratories are numerous throughout the world, numerous in China, Wuhan, elsewhere. They are managed according to a set of stringent rules. Now, you know, they're managed by human. There is human error. Has it escaped? Was it the result of a, let's say, a work of scientists, and has it escaped? Well, nothing proves it, but nothing disproves it either. So let's stick to the fact. And actually, I believe personally that this part of the discussion is not relevant to what's happening now. I mean, where it comes from, okay. Is it relevant now? Is it what matters? I mean, it's out, and it's been seriously out. It's disrupted the world in a way that, personally, in my own lifetime, I haven't seen this before, and I was born in the early 70s. So what we can say now, also something that puzzles me more, actually, is not the fact that it has come, because we were probably expecting that coronaviruses appear once in a while. We remember SARS-CoV-1, obviously, in 2003. Something that still puzzles a lot of people, even researchers in the field, is that when we go back to SARS-CoV-1, for instance, is that SARS-CoV-1 was deadly. I mean, 10%, and it went away. And so far,
entirely.
It's not fully understood why. It's not fully understood why. And right now, we are seeing trends in Europe that show a very strong surge in positive PCR cases, PCR tests. But we don't see that much virulence right now. We don't really know why either. There might be an array of explanations. I will go into this, but the fact that some people, even in the scientific community, start saying, you know, it's going to be the same as SARS-CoV-1, it's going to disappear. Well, it might. You can't say it will not. There's nothing absolutely certain here. What we know for certain, though, in terms of differences between those two viruses are very closely related DNA-wise. When we say 79% proximity between those two viruses DNA-wise, it's actually very close in the world of virus. I mean, I know that we humans are 98% similar to chimpanzees, but actually the distance, those 2% is a much bigger distance than the 20 percentage points difference between those two viruses. So what we know for certain is that the onset of symptoms with SARS-CoV-1 was much faster after contamination, which means that if you were in contact with SARS-CoV-1, so the 2003 SARS, you couldn't spend much more than 48 to 72 hours before massive symptoms would come to you, and then you need to go to the hospital, so then you get isolated. So the chance for you to transmit the virus is limited to the time you had while being subclinical or asymptomatic, which is, as I said, 2 to 3 days. Here we know for a fact again that you can carry the virus for a much longer time, and that translates into a certain level of contagiousness, even if you're asymptomatic or subclinical. And that's probably the reason why the number of infected people per patient in SARS-CoV-2 is higher than the one in SARS-CoV-1.
That's a very interesting point that you make, that the time to the onset of symptoms in SARS-CoV-2 is a little bit longer, or it's really longer than SARS-CoV-1, which brings me back to the question of the origin of the virus. I mean, as you say, the picture that sometimes is painted in Western newspapers, that there was this patient zero on a Wuhan food market, sounds to me like that the virus jumped on the patient zero, released immediately a press release, invited 100 Chinese scientists to the event. It was a big party, and they all celebrated patient zero. I mean, it's a little bit sarcastic to say that, but I think the patient zero probably in the Wuhan province was the first patient that doctors could diagnose with COVID-19 and could trace back to a novel virus. But when I think about it, it would mean if this patient zero was not a real patient zero, then maybe this virus is longer in the world that we currently assume. And going through the newspapers in Austria, there was one article that I read about France, in Paris, I think, and I think another one in Spain, that they could trace particles of the virus in sewers dating back to March last year. And there was another study that I read recently that said that in blood sample from blood donations back to 2015, scientists found a bit of antibodies that might be effective against SARS-CoV-2. So in my mind, it comes together like saying, do we have this virus maybe in our society since 2015 already? What's your opinion on that theory?
Well, all this is absolutely possible. All this is not outlandish.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what is very important when we've said that is that, well, then, if it was there since 2015, why did it break out in 2020, early 2020? Yeah. Why did Wuhan suddenly become the burning fire that it was? And why, from Wuhan, then it spread out to different regions of China and then to the world? Well, for the emergency in Wuhan, one has to dive a little bit into the way the Chinese society works in December and January, i.e. during the weeks before Chinese New Year. During the weeks before Chinese New Year, the inland, or let's say migrations of Chinese people within the country is extremely important, more than half of the Chinese population, which translates into 15% of the world's population, actually changes location during that period. And they carry with them food and gifts and presents for their relatives, but they also carry with them a vast number of pathogens. And this is culturally, I mean, one still has to remember that we're talking about Asia. I mean, if you take Hong Kong and you draw a circle of 5 hours plane flight centered on Hong Kong, you can reach out to between 40 and 45% of the world's population. I mean, this is a fact. Again, this is some really high density regions with cultural specificities, one being Chinese New Year. So in our case, Wuhan, the emergency in Wuhan was unlucky because Wuhan, which is a city in the central China, as you probably have seen on maps, is quite interesting sociologically. It is a place, the Hubei province and Wuhan. First, it is the biggest city in the province. The province is the size of France in terms of population, 70 million, a little bit under 70 million.
70? Wow.
Yes, 70. So it's a sizable province, fine.
Yeah.
The city itself is big, and there is no, there are not many second-tier cities in this province. If you go to other Chinese provinces, you will see the provincial capital, and you will see other cities that are, sizable, and all this interacts nicely. A little bit like when you look at the German map, you've got Frankfurt, you've got Munich, you've got Bremen, you've got Hanover, you've got cities like this, which from time to time can be seen as almost of equal importance. Here we're talking, Paris in France, London in the UK, those big centers.
Yeah.
And Wuhan is this in its province. So it's an attractor. First, it's an attractor from everybody from the countryside. Usually it attracts everybody from the countryside, but there is a lot of rural exodus from within the province, the Hubei province, into Wuhan. Mm. And then those Wuhan people, again, it is a province which is very young. There are excellent universities, so people are well trained. And those guys, those young people, young guys, young ladies, they seek their chance outside the province. So not only they come in, but also then they spread out. And they spread out to Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, Shenzhen, those big, let's say, first-tier cities that Guangzhou, Canton, and that concentrate international business, a lot of employment opportunities, chances for personal development, you name them. And all this coupled with Chinese New Year made up for the perfect storm, and the fact that Wuhan went into lockdown just before Chinese New Year on the 21st of January had one consequence. It prevented the replication of this perfect storm in Wuhan in other big cities, because something that one has to remember when we come back to the origin of the outbreak during the China phase, let's say, and the China phase is January, February, early March, let's put it that way. During the China phase, I was living in Shanghai, nothing happened. In Shanghai, we had 270 patients. Shanghai, Shanghai municipality, 24 million people, 270 patients. And believe me when I say this, I've known enough infectious diseases doctors in Shanghai to know that those figures are true.
Yeah.
They were not swamped by sick people in Shanghai. They were not, but Wuhan was. So there was, in concentration, and then the people were asked to stay there just to protect the other cities, and that was the decision. It was a harsh decision because disrupting Chinese New Year it's difficult for the Chinese government to do this, but that was a harsh decision, but it's probably saved a lot of other lives.
When I listen to you, it sounds like to me that the Wuhan province is in the center of China. And
Central China, that's correct.
And it seems to be like a hub, so people are going to the Wuhan province and venturing out of the Wuhan province. Yes. Then you said, did they say 70 inhabitants in this area?
70 million, 70 million in the Hubei province, and Wuhan per se is 12 million.
Yeah, so 12 million is 1.5 times Austria. And then you have the Chinese New Year upcoming, where you say the majority of the Chinese people travel somewhere in the world, visiting their relatives, parents, go home. And then you have this unknown virus, where you can't say, is it SARS-CoV-1? Is it as deadly? The first assumptions I heard is it should have a fatality rate of more than 10%. So it's understandable in that picture that the Chinese government says, please stay home. Let's find out first what's going on in the world. So, and I think the risk profile of the virus since January, February, how is the risk assessment now in September, October 2020 in China? What has the Chinese scientists or scientific community found out?
there's been a lot of research made at then. In February, March, doctors did what they needed to do in terms of emergency response. They looked for tools in their existing toolbox. So they looked for drugs. Okay, what does work? What does not work? We'll come back to drugs later on, but the first thing was to try and cure people, you know. And then progressively implementing very strong measures countrywide, and being able to test very quickly. One has to admit they were very fast at deploying PCR testing. There was a rather quick control of the number of cases, but then after that, especially after China saw that the virus had spread out to Europe and the US, and I would say much to their surprise, I think, and I've discussed this with a couple of doctors here, they said, we were surprised to see that Europe, for instance, and the US as well, took it so hard. We thought that our public health system was still much weaker than theirs. We thought that what happened in Wuhan was the result of our unpreparedness, and we never thought that the West was seemingly, at least in places, as unprepared as we were. On that basis, they made then a decision. They made a decision which goes back deep into how the country is managed. So again, I will probably let everyone reflect about it, but the decision that was made was to get to 0 domestic cases. We want to go, we are the biggest country in the world, and we want to go to 0, not to 1. We don't want to learn to live with the virus. I mean, this sentence, which I hear quite a lot in Europe, in the US right now, we need to learn to live with the virus. Well, everybody needs to understand China rejects that. We want to live without the virus. In China, we want to live without the virus. So the country sets its mind in a 0 case policy. And that is why on 28th of March, they closed their borders. Nobody comes in. Nobody comes in. When we say nobody comes in, the only people who were able to come in were Chinese citizens, but in chartered planes with very specific testing procedures, with quarantines, and we'll get into that, the way current quarantines are handled, all different measures, but the objective was 0 case policy. And by now, 25th of September, it has succeeded. There are no cases. And the very few cases that we can see and record right now, once in a while, and which are transparently reported by the media, by the way, are cases that are due to visitors or to people coming from other countries. But within the country, there are no cases. Shanghai has not had a single case since when the quarantine was released. We had 5 weeks. We had 5 weeks lockdown in Shanghai. 5 weeks. 17th of February to 23rd of March. 23rd of March, the lockdown was released because there hadn't been any case for 2 weeks. So 8th of March was the last Shanghai case. No case after that. Fact. That's a fact. If there had been a case, there would have been a lockdown. And there was no lockdown. So there was no case. So it has succeeded. The huge consequences on the way the virus is seen and on the economy. I mean, why did China do this? Well, probably it has to do with the fact that they were feeling very bad about what had happened in Wuhan, and you know that everybody knows that China, in terms of political ruling, they want to appear very much in control, and they felt they had lost control and they wanted to regain control, and they set their mind to a seemingly unattainable objective, but they attained it anyway, with a bunch of measures. But the biggest one was closing the borders. I mean, a country that represents more than 20% of the global population, and which is so important to our supply chain, to our overall economy and so on, and they decide to close the borders. And to the point that people like me who are duly living here with valid residence permits, we couldn't, I mean, people with the same resident permit as I have, couldn't come in. And they will be able to come in now, again, 6 months later. In 3 days, the borders reopened for people like me. But before that, they did not. So that was the strongest, let's say. But as a consequence, the number of cases dropped, which means that you can resume at least domestic travel. And China, in terms of economy, let's say, they trusted their own people in their ability to switch to, let's say, successfully addressing the domestic markets. And right now I can give you a figure that shows the risk assessment right now, which is 93%. I mean, the domestic travel within China is back to 93% of the level pre-epidemic, which means planes are full. Domestically, planes are full. It helps airlines because airlines can charge. It helps the people because the people can fly in and out and actually at least do business. And although they can't do the international business the way they used to do before, when it comes to domestic business, they can do it as well. So it has been also a very strong factor of stability. But this couldn't have been done with open borders. This couldn't have been done with open borders. And I really want to insist on that because when you ask New Zealand or Japan or Australia, which are essentially islands, to close their borders, it seems a feasible feat. But when you ask a semi-continent like China to do that, it takes more than a smile to close the borders, you know. And well, decided to do. So I'm not going to discuss the whether it's what European countries or Europe as an ensemble should or should not do. That's not for me to say.
Let's stay with the Chinese society and with China. I think the Europeans who are listening and the Americans are well aware of the situation in their countries. So China closed the borders. But what else did the Chinese government do to, I mean, this zero cases politics is very interesting, but I think closing borders is not enough. So what measures on top of that happened in China to quickly come back to zero?
Okay. Closing the borders was something. Wuhan and the Hubei province had full lockdown for 11 or more than that, 14 weeks. Full lockdown means that you have to stay home, and if you need to buy stuff, only one person of the household can go. Temperature checks, which are still done, by the way. Temperature checks. That's usually the first. That's the first measure that's been done. Temperature checks. It makes sense to a certain, even scientifically. I know that asymptomatic people do not develop fever immediately, but at least it's a pretty good indicator. And if you have at least at that point, if you had fever, if your temperature check was positive, I mean, you have to imagine an everyday life where there's a guard at the door before you enter, for instance, a pharmacy or any commercial center, any office building or anything, and the guard takes your temperature, and if your temperature is above 37.5, the guy won't let you go. The person won't let you go. He will refer you to the proper authorities or the proper, I mean, there is an organization in place. There are enough people in this organization to make sure that you get escorted to a place where somebody will find out why you have a fever. And namely, is this COVID or not? So they don't simply tell you, you have a fever, you can't get in. they tell you you have a fever, and I have a societal responsibility to find out why you have a fever.
Yeah, this is something I realized when my first trip to Japan. It was, I think, also 20 years ago. I saw people on the streets with face masks. So for me as a European, I mean, there was Michael Jackson in the 80s back then. This was the only person that I saw with a face mask. And before I traveled to Japan, I had no experience with that. So I asked my friends. When I saw that the first time, and I have some friends who happen to live in Japan, like you do in Shanghai, and I asked them, why are people doing that? Are they scared of getting sick? And they laughed and they said, no, it's the other way around. So these are people who most likely have a flu or are not sure if they have any contagious virus. And usually they stay home when they are sick, so they don't go out, and they do their best to not spread the viruses. But just imagine single or elderly people. I mean, when they need to go grocery shopping, they need to go out basically, and this is the time when they wear face masks. And I heard this.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it the same in China from the attitude of the people that they see it as their
It is
responsibility?
exactly the same. It was the same at the moment of SARS, and it was the same. It's an everyday life. I was very surprised of something. I've worked in China for 20 years, and I've worked in various types of organizations, including Chinese, let's say, a small and medium-sized private companies. So with a Chinese boss. And you better believe that Chinese bosses are not as cool as European bosses. But as a European, you know, I remember from my work in Paris or in London, if you feel a little sick, you have a bit of you have a little bit of a fever, well, take an aspirin or take a paracetamol or take a Nurofen, and you go to work, you go to do your job. And, you know, yes, you're going to be crying a little bit because your nose will be running or this and that, but you go to the office and then fine. And that was the logic I was in, because as a European, that's what I experienced when I was in Europe. And I'm working with this small and medium-sized company in China, and I've got a lot of work pressure with long hours and limited holidays. And I show up at work exactly in that status. And I said, no, it's all right. I said to my boss, no, it's all right, don't worry. I feel a little sick, but I took a Nurofen, and I'm going to be just fine. And then very sternly he says to me, go home.
Go home, yeah.
There's nothing in this world, in the world we live in here in Shanghai, and I know that we're here to make money, but there's nothing in this world that justifies the fact that you come to the company when you have a little bit of a common, it was probably a common cold. It was nothing more than that. That's funny how they're very tolerant on the fact that I was staying home during a minor one. What from the European, from a European point of view, was a minor health disturbance, very minor. And then you go home, and when you feel better, you come back, because I don't want you to contaminate the other guys.
This is something I completely agree to. I mean, I live in Europe for the whole life, and when I was working for bigger corporations, and in the morning, or also in school back in the 80s, 90s, in the morning when I felt sick, so you have this scratch in the throat, and then I take the temperature and I see 37.5 degrees Celsius. So my response with 17, 18, 19, 20 years was, cool, I have to stay home, I'm sick. So when I started working, I told the story to some people I worked with, and the response was, you're weak.
Yes.
You can't stay home with a cold. You can't stay home with a cold.
That's the European mindset. I remember a lot of people, even especially above the age of 50, sometimes, you know, executives at a certain age, they start to be afraid for their own position in the company and in the society, because maybe the company is struggling a little bit and might fire those expensive older executives to replace them or not by younger people. And I remember some 53, 55-year-old executives would tell me, we'll go to the office. We'll go to the office because if you you don't let a common cold in front of the work because, you know, and then they were feeling the pressure. Well, it doesn't happen here. Yes, we work hard, but we work hard only when we're healthy. If we're not healthy, we stay home. I mean, it's a societal matter. I've visited Korea, Japan less, but Korea. I spent a bit of time in Taiwan. It's very widespread. It's a very widespread practice. If you feel well, you're gonna really work long hours, and you know, Japan, maybe you can tell, Christian, and it's probably the same, but if you don't feel well, nobody will ever believe that you are weak. They will think that, okay, he doesn't feel well. Beside his or her own state, what's important is that the organization keeps running, so we don't want a virus coming through, you know, and a common cold or a flu are being transmitted to somebody else. That's what happened.
For Japan, I would put it, it is seen as social responsibility. So
yes.
It's not, it's more a strength. So
here,
when you
here
are,
as well,
when people are not sure if they have a virus and they stay home, it's more seen as they are thoughtful adults and they take responsibility not to infect other people. And maybe this was the reason why the Asian countries were more successful in containing the virus than the European countries. One of the reasons.
There were many multiple factors to that. The one very important thing is that they set very clear objectives, you know, and those objectives, if they go against individual freedom, well, objectives go against individual freedom, and that's how it goes, you know. We'll talk about let's continue about the measures, because it's very interesting to see what measures were taken in China, because I hear a lot of things that essentially say that we were in prison, or, you know, and the measures that were taken were a mix of very harsh measures, very, you know, liberty killing, and very liberal measures. I'll take one example. I exercise outdoors. I always exercise outdoors. I know that, Christian, you and I have this in common. And I exercise outdoors. And even during Shanghai lockdown, the 5 weeks of Shanghai lockdown, nobody would prevent me from exercising outdoors. The only limitation I had was that I could not exercise together with another person. I needed to exercise alone. But I could cycle, because I'm a cyclist. I could cycle throughout Shanghai with no mask on, and there were cops all over the place, and nobody would stop me. I had a mask in my pocket just in case, but nobody would stop me. And the regulation was, lockdown prevents any group training, but individual training is okay. And when France implemented its lockdown, you could not go beyond one kilometer away from your home. That was less stringent, you know. Here, that was less stringent than that. Something that was much more stringent and fully applied was there was a very immediate recognition that transmission of the virus was very fast and facilitated in public transport. So even now, you don't wear a mask, be it the metro, be it the buses, be it airports or train stations, you don't get in. You just don't get in. And in the metro, at some point, it's less the case now, but at some point, when depending on the level of safety required by the local government, if you were seen in the metro with your mask slightly down, for instance, below the nose, guard comes to you and makes you readjust your mask. And you better do it, because those guards are armed, you know. So again, targeted measures, very strongly enforced. Obviously, so we talked about masks, we talked about temperature checks, we talked about transport, the control during transportation, very, very strong, because yes, metros, I mean, confined spaces, enclosed spaces. We talked about, obviously, gatherings. There were a lot of gathering cancellations. Even now, we are not back to normal. Stadiums, there is a gauge. It's the same as Europe. There is a gauge in stadiums, you know. It's 3,000, 5,000 people to go to soccer, football matches, that type of thing, you know. In my line of exercising, which is cycling, those big group cyclings of several hundred people, they are now back on track since the first one that was organized after the outbreak was the 25th of June in Eastern China. 25th of June, we could come back to several hundred people together biking without masks and so on. But before that, that was not the case. So a lot of still a lot of control on this, but absolutely zero control. For instance, restaurants, bars, nightlife, nothing, and no masks, and people don't wear masks. We don't need masks. We don't. Nowhere in the country is now required to wear a mask for. In those settings, and restaurants operate at full capacity.
Except public transport, I think, or public transport.
But public transport is still very, very stringent, and you don't get in. I mean, they don't let you in, and obviously they keep checking your temperature all the time, and this is very much kept. And of course, When
I look at the newspapers, there was one article describing the situation in China, and it sounded, I mean, there was a music festival with 1.2 million visitors, and it looked to me, there are no measures anymore. But what you tell me right now is that it's not the case. So China has still closed the borders. It's
hidden measures. They had closed the borders, and when nobody gets in, then the sick people inside, either they die or they get better.
Yeah.
But then the virus is gone.
Okay.
You see what I mean? I mean, there was no contamination. There was no. They stopped the contamination chain within after having closed the border.
And this is a measure that is still ongoing. So when I would like to travel to China, I would be quarantined for 2 weeks.
This is how it goes right now. For anybody who wants to come to China, including Chinese passport holders, including citizens, you know, who have constitutionally the right to come back to their country, you know, Chinese citizens. You need a PCR test from overseas within the negative result within 72 hours of your departure. China puts the burden on checking this to the airlines. It's a very funny measure. It's the responsibility of the airline to guarantee that everybody is negative on their plane. Which means that airlines, when they sell their tickets right now, they need to check manually the PCR test of each and every of their passengers. It's not a government requirement, it's a government requirement to airlines. Which means that flights are expensive because there's a lot of manual treatment before they can sell a flight. If you look up flights, obviously flights are scarce, but if you look up flights anyway, you're going to see that prices are very high. Prices are very high, not only due to supply and demand, but also due to the manual processing that has been put, the burden of which has been put on airlines themselves. If they get positive cases on their planes, they get their next rotation gets cancelled. I mean that's what China does. Some things they take care of themselves. Some things they delegate to. And when you arrive from wherever in the world except Macau, only people from Macau now can go into China without quarantine. Macau is a very small territory that counts as China anyway. And when you get in, how does it go? Yes, you have to undergo quarantine, but you need to understand that the circulation from the moment you leave the plane to the moment you are allowed to go back to your home 2 weeks after that, all those circulations, they are completely airtight. They are completely tight. You don't meet the outside world. You do not meet the outside world. Mm-hmm. Dedicated aisles, dedicated vehicles, dedicated personnel in full suits, dedicated quarantine facilities. You don't get to choose. Dedicated personnel who give you your meals and etc. 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 Quarantines. Several friends have undergone quarantines. It's as close as it gets to being in jail, minus the environment, and obviously you're still you're in a mid-range hotel room, but you can't get out of it. You can't breathe outside the outside air. You're in. You can't go out of your room. You can't get out of your room. If you quarantine at home, they will install at your door a device that will record if you open your door. And if you open your door, there's somebody who's going to come in and try and see, okay, who opened the door and where did you go? If you can, because in some cases you can quarantine at home, but usually it's very, very much airtight. And everything is provided for, except that now you have to pay for it. It's charged to you as a citizen. It's not that expensive. I mean, it's what, 40 euros a night plus plus board. That's room and plus board, like 50 euros a day. Well, you still have to put together 700 euros, ish. You still have to put 700 euros down on top of your plane ticket, of course. So you really need a good reason to come back.
So basically, when I understand you right, it means when I want to travel to China, I need a negative PCR test to board the plane. Then when I land in China, I'm quarantined. So it's basically
you are quarantined and you get tested at least 3 times. I mean, one of the questions that we want to address is obviously the testing, and the fact that testing comes back with a lot of false negatives. Yeah. How do they sort that out in China? The simplest possible way. If the risk of false negative is, let's say, 20%, if you do the test 4 times, this risk drops significantly. Significantly, you're pretty much certain. So you get tested before you board, you get tested immediately upon arrival, then at J+3 and at day +7 and day +14. So 3 times.
But the full PCR. But the full PCR experience with a sample taken from the nose.
Absolutely. That's another painful matter. And that's how they do it. That's how they do it. No half measures. No half measures on that aspect. So because on that basis, us people inside within the country get now the free life. What I call the free life. Biking as groups, not wearing masks on the streets. The border control and quarantine measures were the tightest I've ever seen. The tightest I've ever seen.
So basically, it means for me as a traveler for business, going to China for a weekend is not possible. So it doesn't make any sense. So it must be 2 months or 3 months that it's really does it make some sense? So it's more like relocating or living for a certain time period, which would not be impossible.
Right now, it is a problem, and it has consequences on the economy. But those consequences have been mitigated by the fact that the Chinese people, companies and businessmen have a lot to work on in better serving the domestic market. So yes, they do less international, but
I cannot compare the domestic market in China with the domestic market in Austria. I mean, it's 1.4 billion.
One has to do with their advantages, and I'm fully with you on that point. I mean, we cannot compare. And a full lockdown of the European borders theoretically could have produced similar results, but the level of European control and integration, plus the philosophy of Europe when it comes to a free market economy, it goes so much against that. You know,
I'm not so sure. Just let's stay with China a little bit. I think the Chinese government is doing the same to their own citizens. So when somebody is diagnosed with SARS-CoV-2, I think it's also quarantine, testing, and separating the person from the society.
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
Completely separating the person from the society and separating their family. I mean, for instance, if this person is the only one positive, maybe wife or spouse or children are negative, they still will be quarantined at home, just in case.
But with strong measurements if the people really stay at home. So you said that the government is installing
temperature reports via mobile phone, self temperature reports twice a day, etc., etc. Yeah, all those aspects, absolutely.
What data is the government collecting with the cell phone?
Oh yes, a very good question. We have QR codes. It's a QR code which tracks your. I mean, primarily, one has to understand this. In China, since when was that? Probably 5 years ago, there is no burner cell phones. You can't have a burner phone in China. It doesn't exist. Any SIM card has to be connected to an ID number, be it a passport or a national identity number. That's first. Second, remember that the three mobile phone operators are all state-owned. It's like, you know, Apple being owned by the US government or something. They're all state-owned.
Separate discussion.
So access to data is not an issue. Let's put it that way. And on that basis, if you don't have a burner phones, right now, every single SIM card in circulation in the country is connected to an ID number, or let's say a person with a valid ID. Every single SIM card, there's no burner phone, except maybe foreign numbers. But foreign numbers, you can't get the application that tracks you, so you can't travel. Because you need to show the code if you want to travel. Anyway, and they collect mostly roaming data. Where have you been? It's based on the array of antennas. Where have you been? That's why they map. Because, for instance, it happened near the Myanmar border a couple of weeks ago. Suddenly, 2 cases. In a rather small city, 140,000 people, which is at the border with Myanmar. So I'm talking about border control, but the border with Myanmar, there probably is a way to get through, you know. And they found out 2 positive cases based on temperature measurements and routine everyday life implemented. 2 positive people in this city. Well, first decision is city lockdown. Nobody leaves. Immediately, city lockdown.
So you have regional lockdowns in China.
Oh yeah. You have regional lockdowns, but that's the only one we had. We had one here. We had one in Dalian, and we had one back in July in Beijing because they found out contamination in food samples. But this is what I wanted to mention this. I saw the news, what was that? I mean, 1 week ago or something. China imports a lot of food because China is not self-sufficient food-wise. It's funny when you think about such a big country, but it's far from being self-sufficient food-wise. So they import a lot of food, and they import in particular seafood. And in one case, they found out that an Indonesian supplier of seafood had contaminated. Was there clams or lobsters or fish? I can't remember, but they found. I mean, they routinely test, and they found out there was contamination on them. Well, they don't think twice. They seize the inventory and they stop the channel. They ban instantly the supplier. They don't think think twice. They just say, let's cut as fast as possible
it's
any
really
possible chain of transmission.
It's no half measure. So it's basically they do what they need to do.
No half measure, which are targeted just to make sure that everyday life, as quickly as possible for us, let's say normal people or middle class people, can go back to normal as fast as possible. It has to do with trying to give the maximum number of people the minimal disruption.
So it's basically the Chinese government doesn't question the severity of the virus anymore. They have made up their mind. It's better to live without the virus than with the virus, and they do what's necessary. I mean, when you said border control, I think the biggest mistake people make in the world, probably I'm also doing that, is comparing China as a country with countries like Austria, Switzerland, Hungary. That's not the right level to compare China. It's more like a continent by itself. So it's like whole Europe 3 times.
That's true.
When I think not only the population but border control, I think it's very easy for inbound flights. You can do PCR tests. You mostly, when people can afford the ticket to China these days, you mostly have educated people who are compliant, who follow the rules. But when I think more in the rural areas in China, so to the Himalayan, probably the level of education is not that high, and maybe people are not really aware. So it must be really a tough effort for the Chinese government to really keep the borders shut.
Well, I happen to love borders. I love borders because I was born near borders in France. I was born near the Dreiländerecke. Maybe you don't know that. I was born near the Dreiländerecke between France, Germany, and Switzerland. Which means I love borders. Those border areas, it's always fascinating to me. When I go to San Diego, I always go to the Mexican border just to have a look, for instance. And in China, even land borders with Russia, with Vietnam, with even Hong Kong itself. Oh boy, the walls, serious walls. Nets, gridlocks, cameras, barbed wires, armed guards. Oh, even in the middle of the desert, in the frontier with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and all those borders are clearly marked, guarded, monitored, and you don't get in easily. You really don't get in easily. So maybe, this case, for instance, Myanmar, Myanmar was interesting because Myanmar, yes, as you say, it's hilly, it's mountainous. There's a certain permeability. It's a poor area. For instance, in the north as well, the Siberian, the easternmost Siberian border, going towards Vladivostok and that area. A lot of Chinese people go there to farm, and they farm in Russia for the Russians. Those borders are maybe a little more permeable, but on the spot, they can send people, be it the army, be it the police, and make sure that those areas get seriously guarded. And crossing an inland border in China is not easy. It's really not easy. It's really not easy. And then they have the structure in place. When you think about the Franco-Italian, the border between France and Italy, well, there are the Alps, and everybody believes the Alps make a perfect natural border. Well, it does not. We know now.
I grew up in the Alps, so it's. Let's stay a little bit with the Asian society. I think a huge difference to other societies is that when it comes to public health, the entire society, I also see it in Japan, I see it in Taiwan, I see it in South Korea. Also, you mentioned it for China. They are compliant. They do what's necessary to support the government without questioning it. And I think this is probably a little bit of a difference in Europe, but because when I think back to March, I was really surprised that the lockdown measures in Europe worked very well. So also the European population was very compliant, did follow it, and it looked like we also were successful in containing the virus.
Yes, I agree with all that.
Except Sweden. Sweden went their own way. So it was also very interesting to see. But currently, it looks like we have in Europe a second wave coming. PCR tests, I think in Austria, we had 1.4 million tests since March, and with 40,000 people diagnosed as infected. So it seems like the last weeks that the numbers are going up. The question is, when I think to China, it's clear they've closed the borders, but I think it's not possible in Europe, and they also see a little bit of difficulty with the market closing the borders for Austria. I mean, Austria has 9 million inhabitants. Meanwhile, it's a small market, so we are highly dependent to work together with other countries. So containing the virus with closed borders seems nearly impossible in Europe. The interesting thing is, I mean, with growing numbers of cases, we also see what effect the virus has on the population. And when we go back to the discussion to the severity of the virus, I think it's quite interesting, because you mentioned that Europeans say that we need to live with the virus, and maybe this is the only way for the European society and culture as it is right now. But what really was astonishing to me is the first time when I heard from the virus in March, February, January this year, Q1, I thought, my God, I mean, hopefully it's not like the Spanish flu from the severity of cases. And when I heard the numbers that probably 10 to 20% of people who catch the virus die, I thought, oh God, this is not going well. When I look now at the reported cases, and when I look at the figures, it looks like the virus doesn't do any harm to people below 65 years old. So the fatality rate, or the infection fatality rate, is really close to zero. How is the Chinese society, as a scientific society, seeing these figures that we observe here in Europe?
Absolutely. Yes, this is a very important aspect, because China has long had very strong virologists, very good scientists within the Academy of Sciences, within international organizations, performing high-level research on viruses. I mean, we've seen this with all the information that have come out about how in Wuhan virologists work on bats. On that basis, what is now known, and again, there are references that show it, what is now known for certain is that this virus, based on its structure, it actually interacts in your body with much more than only your lungs or your nose or your throat. It attacks, and let's say, it influences, it has an impact on other cells in your body, and that can be the heart, that can be the neurons, that can be also the vascular walls, that can be the gastrointestinal tract. For scientific reasons that are now a little bit better understood, we have a virus that can find its way into your body in various places. And my understanding and my conclusion on that is that, isolatedly speaking, the impact on your body is not as severe, or let's say it doesn't put you down as severely as the flu does, for instance. I mean, if you and I had flus, I mean, I had flus, and without taking any medicine, and you're just down, you know, you can't move. You're seriously, but it's in one single place. The flu virus, it kind of goes to one single place. Here we have a virus that is probably less lethal per se, but that impacts your immune system in many different places. Put it that way, it's the difference between Napoleon Column going to Moscow versus Islamic terrorists attacking at the same time 20 different Russian cities. Let's make it that difference, you know. And which means that the outcome of the disease, to me, and to the scientific community I've been discussing with, is directly connected to the status of your immune system. The better your immunity, the better off you are. And we know, we've known this for years, and it's being studied right now as a key diagnosis treatment modality, but the immune system takes a very important drop around the age of 65. It's there is, you know, it goes down, and then there is, you know, a stair step. After it gets steeper after 65. So I'm not surprised on that basis that people who suffer most from COVID-19 are people above the age of 65, because then any multifactorial or multi-organ attack will take quite the toll on the immune system of the person, and then comes the question of co-infection.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. I think what we are lucky, what we're really lucky is that we don't see these high fatality rates across the entire population. What's very interesting to me is, I mean, when I compare it to the flu virus, when I look at influenza, severe influenza outbreaks, the most harmed population are the kids. So it seems like the coronavirus is not doing very much to the kids, lucky for us, but it has a severe impact on elderly people. And I think this is scientifically proven. And also on people who are already sick. And I don't only talk about diabetes, obesity, cancer, and stuff like that, which is quite clear. I also talk about secondary infections like catching the flu at the same time with the coronavirus. So this can really mean the flu weakens the immune system already, and then comes the coronavirus. So it really can cause severe problems, health problems.
That is exactly right. And that is one of the reasons why, for instance, back in March and up till now, if you have a COVID, and if you're diagnosed in China with a COVID that requires you to be hospitalized, they will give you antibiotics. Not to kill the virus, because antibiotics don't kill the virus. Oh no, they don't give you antibiotics to kill the virus, obviously, but they give you antibiotics just in case a co-infection comes in, and that could be, especially in the case of China, a community-acquired pneumonia. I mean, mycoplasma pneumonia, or that type of thing. And so they give you azithromycin, and when you take azithromycin or any other well-established antibiotic, just to make sure that nothing else comes on top, you know. And then when it comes to managing the COVID, well, there are other management possibilities. There is in China a funny drug, which is a broad spectrum antiviral that exists only in China and Russia, that has been used, has been put to test, nothing conclusive on the benefits of this drug. When it comes to, you know, it's not the miracle cure. There is no miracle cure at all, obviously. But there is right now they stick to, for instance, the very controversial hydroxychloroquine treatment. It was topping the list of recommendations of the Chinese government back in the days of February, March, and April. And, you know, right now they don't have cases, so I don't know what they give, but they don't have cases. But I would believe they would give exactly the same modalities. I've checked a little bit for our chat, and they would believe they give the same.
I mean, you're lucky with the measures that you don't have any cases, but I think it's quite clear that the Chinese government really considers this virus as a severe threat still. So this is why they close the borders. This is why they quarantine people. This is why they make regional lockdowns when they detect cases. And I think this is also probably the advice from China to the European population to take the governmental advices seriously. and
Yep.
to be a little bit more compliant. Because the virus is a threat. That I think the thing is that when I look at the figures, it really doesn't look like that. Because it's more this sneaky little guy who's coming in. I'm not really dangerous to the healthy
No,
population.
there's one aspect that we forgot to mention.
Yeah.
A very important aspect. I mean, China is a big country with a huge number of children as well. And a very, very, very strong accent is put on children's education. And at all costs, China doesn't want to disrupt that, because this is the continuation of the generation. It has to do with the Asian mentality, you know that, and so on and so forth. And, you know, China is a country that produces between 7 and 8 million bachelor degree graduates every year. I mean, this is a serious amount of people, you know.
Yeah.
and obviously it goes down to from kindergarten upwards, you know. And the decision was made in March and April to do this, to get to 0 cases, also with what in mind? With the objective of being able to have a non-disrupted, absolutely normal start of classes this September. And in classes, children don't need to wear masks. Teachers do not wear masks. There are tests, obviously. I mean, checks, temperature controls for every kid every single morning. Obviously, teachers as well. No, we don't want to disrupt children's education. And once you have said this, you need to set your goal as zero disease. You can't live with the disease and expect no disruption at school. You can't.
I completely.
It doesn't work. Those two statements are conflictual. It just doesn't work. So they made this decision and they enforced it.
I completely agree that the children's education must be protected in any case. But when I look at the numbers in Europe, I think the virus is here. So there are infected people, there are hospitalized people. I don't know if we are beyond the point of no return, that lockdowns or shutting the borders now to really help, except closing whole Europe for 2 months, which would economically be, I don't know if it works. Also to the education of the children. So what we need, I think that we can, I also don't believe that we can go back to this situation that China keeps the borders closed forever and Asia shuts off from the rest of the world. So we need our scientists to find solutions on the drug side and vaccine side.
Find solutions. We need before vaccines. I personally believe that we need drugs. We need therapeutics. I mean, antivirals have been around. Against the flu, there were good, average, and bad antivirals that were produced and developed, but a lot of them saved lives. I mean, we remember all those from the flu outbreaks. We need antivirals. Now that we understand better the virus structure and the way that we could, you know, attack the virus or modify the cell environment just to avoid, you know, I mean, the objective of a drug would not be to cure everybody within 2 days. The objective is to make sure that there is no severe case anymore. If you turn the COVID into a flu, you're fine.
Yeah.
If you avoid emergency response, if you avoid ventilation, if you avoid those, you're fine. And now the efforts in China are below what's being done in the West. They are below. And they are below because intrinsically new drug development in China has not quite caught up yet to the level of the West. And this I see it for a fact. Even biotechs founded by very high-level returnees who studied in the best American or European universities and came back to China to launch their drug development companies. What are they going to do against COVID now here in China? They are going to do, screening efforts. They are going to screen compounds. They are going to try and put together cocktails of existing compounds. But de novo compound development is something the West is still better at. It takes time. From what I can see or hear, it seems to be there might be good drugs. I mean, acceptable drugs. I mean, I don't consider remdesivir as an acceptable drug. I mean, this is don't get me started on that.
I think it's approved in Europe, so
yeah,
but it must be good.
A lot to say about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, getting a new drug, there might be good options. I mean, will we have enough patients? I mean, the problem with the drug right now is, will we have enough patients in Europe to test the drug? And then are initiatives, are biotech or pharma ready to test new compounds right now? I know Pfizer is working in that field. Have they come up with a candidate? I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't checked recently, and they might not. But what I can tell you is that in China, nobody really works hard on a drug for a very simple reason also, which is, even if they had a compound, they can't test it in China. We have no patients.
Yeah. I mean,
so now the question comes, obviously, is how the hell did they do to make vaccines? Well, they tested, their vaccine clinical trials were conducted out of China. And we've seen that, read that. I mean, Brazil and so on and so forth. Yeah. And we'll come back to the vaccines later. Probably, I believe that based on what you want to do, it's probably the end of our talk. But vaccines is an important aspect.
I mean, it's a little bit a question of values that we tap into a little bit. And what I like to see and what I think is important to the human race is that the whole world works together. So it's basically Asia, China, together with Europe, with the United States, America, and Africa. So to put it all, we need to unite. And from what I understand from the talk that we have right now is that China will keep its borders closed and will stick to the zero cases policy. So a drug...
So far, that is true.
Yeah.
So far, that is true.
So I mean, they made up their mind, so I don't assume that they will go back and forth, that they will say, we open a little bit, and then, so they need a clear change in the world, because the virus is out in the rest of the world. I think can a drug really be a solution? I mean, zero cases, it just treats the severe cases, the moderate, mild cases, but it would not support the zero patient policy. So I think you mentioned already the vaccine space. So I think the only thing that can guarantee zero cases is a vaccine that works. Would it be a right interpretation that this might be an event that the Chinese government changes its mind and say, okay, let's open the borders like we are used to? It's speculation. So
right now it is speculation, but that is the consensus. The consensus is that, I mean, what I don't want to do is to minimize the impact, the economic impact of shutting down the borders on the Chinese economy. I mean, I might have, led everybody to think that it was easy for China to do this because anyway, they had got such a big internal market and that's fine. No, that is not fine. There are a lot of businesses and projects and companies that employ a lot of people that are severely impacted by the border quota.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I would like to add something to that. I also don't believe it was easy. I mean, I think the Chinese economy is probably the only one who can be self-sufficient for a longer period of time, or almost self-sufficient, compared to Europe. I mean, we were working hard since the end of the 80s. To unite the world and to integrate the economy worldwide, to integrate China, to integrate Russia, African countries, to work closer together between Europe and the United States, which was very unique in the world, because we have to think back a few years ago, all these countries made constantly war against each other. So it was a great development to see in the 90s and the new millennium that the world is coming to a peaceful state, more or less. So now we have the virus, and I think the only economy that is really has the potential to be a little bit of self-sustaining is China with 1.4 billion inhabitants. I don't see it for Europe, and I don't see it for the States.
There is a certain degree of self-sufficiency when it comes to manufactured goods. I mean, being the factory of the world, or let's say the production line of the world as it is, anything you can think of that you might need in your everyday life is made in China. Now, obviously, energy, construction, and food are still items whereby China highly relies on imports. But energy, construction materials, and food, all this can be put on cargoes or onto planes, and those disruptions it's still doable, you know. So I agree with this self-sufficient statement on that basis, because the industrial power of the country is still very high. They produce anything you would think about needing, you know. So on that basis, that's right. However, there is still a lot of entanglement with the international economy, and there is also a lot of very important ongoing projects that would require the presence of foreign specialists in China and the presence of Chinese people in foreign countries for further development. So let's not minimize this. I mean, foreign companies are huge employers in China, and if they feel the heat because of the current border control, they will lay off people, and China doesn't want people to be laid off. So it was not an easy measure. Self-sufficiency exists. One point we can add on self-sufficient is that China also has a huge level of personal savings. The households are sitting on a lot of money. So even if they have economic hardship for a while, they have money stashed. You know, the savings, personal savings, individual savings are high. Then a feature of the population as well. But the borders need to be reopened at some point. One of the things as well, I mean, for instance, there are sectors of the economy in China which are suffering like crazy. Airlines are really suffering, because yes, a lot of them are still doing domestic travel, but domestic travel is cheap and it doesn't make money. I mean, you don't make money with that, and you can fly only your small airlines. I mean, Hainan Airlines, which is one of the largest private airline in China, all their big Boeings are grounded because they can't fly overseas. They are losing as much as they can, and China Eastern and all the same and so on. And hospitality, I mean, big hotels, hotel chains, not only international chains, but local chains, huge employers. Those companies employ a lot of people, and they suffer a lot, and you can't keep everything shut. I mean, China also welcomes the world in massive exhibition. You've seen those exhibition centers that can host 250,000 people together in the same place. I mean, everything here is at a standstill now due to border control. And I mean, let's not say that border control is the solution for everything. This is not true. It is an evil as well. I mean, for China, it has brought down this certain hardship. How can this be solved? It can be solved either if we find a treatment that the world gets consensus about, and then okay, there is a drug, everybody has it. As long as you have the drug with you, you're fine. And if you don't have the drug with you, we don't care, because in China hospitals, we're going to give you that drug and you're going to be fine, and you're going to avoid being in emergency response in China, and you're going to be just okay.
But do you see the change? I mean, currently, you said the government says 0 cases. The
government says 0 cases because they know their vaccines are coming up. I've read the papers about those vaccines. Again, those vaccines are made mostly by companies that have a government company background. I mean, a government background, public sector. I mean, state-owned background, and I think they are fairly, let's say, confident about their vaccine because they gave the current version that are about to come out. They're going to come out in December. They're about to come out, and they're going to give. They already gave the vaccine to the army, and the Chinese government doesn't want to create problems with their army because it's when the army disconnects from the government that big problems happen. You know, I mean, this is geopolitics.
And the Chinese army is a very strong one. So
the Chinese army, you know, a lot of people. So those people get vaccinated. What the consensus is that when Chinese people have access to a vaccine, they are going to go and to be incentivized for vaccination, and it will become almost mandatory, not necessarily for going out, but for coming back into the country. But this should not be surprising. I mean, there are a lot of areas in the world whereby you need to have a vaccination before you go there. I mean, yellow fever, dengue. I mean, we've heard of many diseases. I mean, if you want to travel in certain places in Africa, you need to vaccinate against this. Now, maybe China will say, okay, you can't come in if you're not vaccinated. And on the contrary, if you are vaccinated and your vaccine is a Chinese vaccine administered in a Chinese hospital, you probably will be able to skip quarantine, and life of people like me, for example, will go back to normal.
Maybe that is a new business model then for Chinese airports to have the hospital for the vaccination next to the airports. When I look at, I mean, I think we need this unity in the world again. My fear is that the world starts falling apart, and I don't think it's a good scenario. So we need some solution to that. When I look at Europe a little bit, you said that the Chinese population, they have usually high savings. When I look at Europe, I have more the feeling, I mean, I read studies and they say 99.5% of the world's population focusing on the United States and Europe are not millionaires, which means they live from paycheck to paycheck. So cutting them off from employment and from paychecks means that they quickly start coming to a point in their life where they can't pay their bills anymore, they can't purchase food, they risk losing their houses, and this would not be a good development. So to come back to normal, there could be two cases. And one is that we find out the virus is not as, it's like a common cold virus, which I don't see really coming, because when I look at the numbers, it's not dangerous for healthy population, but the minute a healthy person catches a flu, the picture changes. It's the same for elderly people, it's the same for cancer patients, diabetes patients, and all other patients that have some disease that weakens the immune system. So the only solution then, if we can, let's just put the hypothesis on the table and say the virus is severe and it will stay that way, then we need a vaccine. And vaccine development takes time and needs time. So before our call, I was reading a Forbes article, which was very critical to the vaccine development. And from a time when I was working for an Austrian vaccine development company, I remember that the phase 3 trials need to prove efficacy in the field in a large population. So what I expected when I thought about a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2, that the vaccine must prove that it prevents people from dying. Looking at the endpoint of the Western pipeline, I'm not so sure if there is really this endpoint in the studies. Well, how do you see it?
I've read the same articles, and I am extremely surprised and unhappily surprised by those studies, and that by the fact that on the assumption that governments are so desperate that they will take any vaccine no matter what, are applying for early approval based on testing on, what was that? Several hundred people only?
Yeah, 150 or
Several
something.
hundred people only? I mean, several hundred people in the vaccine world, we understand that this is a joke. I mean, you need at least, at the very, very least, a 5-digit number, and more likely a 6 or 7-digit number of people to display, as you said, efficacy and protection. In China, the vaccine, the first case, the phase 1 and 2 were conducted in China mostly. But now the phase 3, they could not, because they needed large scale, and the zero case policy has killed the number of patients.
Yeah.
So they went to Brazil, and for instance, among others, but they went to Brazil. I mean, Sinovac has Sinopharm, sorry, has been doing their phase 3 in Brazil. According to international standards, by the way. I mean, this is an area where, as you know, harmonization works throughout the world, but better than it used to. And it seems to, we need the final readout, but right now we have no red lights showing us that, for instance, I have a lot of internal contacts in those vaccine companies, and none of them is telling me like, okay, we need to stop because this doesn't work, or we need to stop because we have a case of unknown death due to the vaccination, or etc., etc. So what is certain is that what I've seen, again, for a fact, is that on small scale trials of the most advanced 3 Chinese vaccines, the dosage has triggered antibody production by the subject of the study in 100% of cases. So that we were talking about small scale. So I mean, again, several hundred of people, and those were only phase 2. Those were not pivotal trials. You know, phase 2 trials say, okay, A, it's safe at that level, and B, it triggers an immune response. Now, does this immune response last 2 months, 6 months, 2 years? We don't know. And we can't know because we need a longitudinal follow-up of these cohorts, and the time has been too short so far. But what is important to know is that this is not enough to authorize a vaccine, at least in my mind. And in China's mind is the same, because China has had those results since June or July or something, like Russia has, for instance. And on that basis, they gave the vaccine to the army. And nobody died in the army to the extent that, okay, so safety, at least safety, I mean, this is fine. One has to remember something about vaccines, something that is lesser known in Europe. When SARS came out in 2003, a lot of people worked on a vaccine. The only reason why a SARS vaccine didn't come out on the market is not because it was not technically done. It was because it was rendered useless because the virus was gone. But coronavirus vaccination, based on the SARS experience, Asia had an edge. Hong Kong labs cooperating with Chinese labs, Asia had an edge. Vaccine scientists in the West do not have the same experience as vaccine developers in the East when it comes to coronavirus vaccination, because there was a lot of work made on SARS. So let's not think, you know, when we say, you know, a vaccine takes 2 years to develop, 2-3 years, or else it's baseless or useless. Yeah, well, it's not that simple. I mean, we started out working on COVID-19 vaccine based on the work that had been done on SARS. A lot of things were done already. We knew in what direction to go, you know. So on that basis, personally, I'm quite confident that a vaccine is going to come out in China quickly. Sinopharm has announced pricing. It's going to be a 2-shot, 150 euros max for the 2 shots. It's a 2-shot 1 week interval. even if it gives protection only for the season, well, it's better than nothing. And, you know, if it translates into freedom of travel, it gives back the opportunity to Chinese airlines to put their big jumbo jets to use and fly people around again, and make sure that the facilities and the infrastructure that China has built as the industrial and commercial hub of the world is still being put to use. I mean, let's not think that China can live without the West. They can't live without the West. There is a certain level of self-sufficiency, but you can't cut off this international cooperation and this international travel. You just can't.
I completely agree to that. I mean, we are not in 1700 something.
Exactly.
We are in 2020, and I think no country can afford trying to live without the rest of the world. All problems that we face right now are interconnected problems. So no country can separate from that. And I mean, when a vaccine is mandatory to have to come back to this old normal that we are used to, which means we can work together, we can collaborate. It would be a good thing to have that. But from my gut feeling, do you see it really coming? I mean, when we don't see mortality endpoints and the governments all over the world really say we have to get rid of this virus. I mean, I think the only way to get rid of this virus is a vaccine then that works in 100% of the cases.
Well, the flu vaccine doesn't work in 100% of the cases, but at least we need in the vaccine world, you know, Christian, as well as I do, that we need 90 plus or 92 plus, 94 plus. That is now the question is dual. First of all, if there are no mortality endpoints in trials, it's baseless and it's unacceptable, and I'm entirely with you on that. My understanding is that the trials that were made and conducted by the Chinese vaccine makers in Brazil and other areas had those endpoints, because I have not seen anything in the Chinese FDA, which is an NMPA, outlining the possibility of a green channel and quick approval of vaccines without a proper regulatory work. That could be that will be interesting to follow, because obviously we want to see the conditions under which those vaccines have been developed. But what I'm more concerned about is the impact of geopolitics on this international cooperation that you are calling for. I see China being very happy with people having been injected with the Chinese vaccine, but refusing people who will have been vaccinated by the Moderna or any of the Western vaccines. Not necessarily on scientific grounds. You hear what I mean? You know. Imagine you, Austrian citizen, you have a visa to come to China. You can show that you have been properly vaccinated in such a way that China cannot challenge the authenticity of your vaccination document. But even though, will they say, okay, on that basis, Mr. Soschner, you can come into China with no quarantine? That is a question mark. That is a question mark.
Yeah.
Maybe they will only accept, because they will first consider the welfare of their population, and they will first let their own population go to Europe for tourism, for instance, and then come back with no quarantine. And then at least the Chinese can go out and come back. Now, for the foreigners to come in, I will have the chance to undergo local vaccination, but not many people will. Not many people will. And the question about the business travelers is bound to remain open for a while. I think by Chinese New Year, February, if the vaccines come out in December and are sufficiently available, I think by Chinese New Year, there is a chance that the Chinese population and people like me who live in China, although not being Chinese nationals, but who live in China under the a residence permit system, can resume almost full normal life. Now, business traveling from the outside, this is going to depend. This is going to be not only a scientific discussion, and that's something that frightens me, because except if, but they won't do it, except if maybe some countries would do it, I mean, I would see, for instance, there are some European countries which are very much entangled with China. I'll take Greece as an example. The relationship between Greece and China is very strong on various aspects. And maybe Greece, I don't know if Europe allows for that, but maybe Greece will say, okay, I'll take the Chinese vaccine. And if they take the Chinese vaccine, maybe the Greek can fly to China. I mean, and I don't know if within Europe or outside of Europe there will be cases like this, but I know that I've been contacted by a Central European country which is not part of the European Union. I can't tell the name, but when I've said this, I'm not many candidates, but Central European country, not part of the European Union, looking to buy Chinese vaccine.
I think that there were very interesting points in what you said right now. I mean, I'm a Democrat and I love personal freedom, but I think the coronavirus is a real threat. So it's luckily not as severe as we thought it to be. So touch wood, yes. But it has a severity that we really have to be cautious. You mentioned before the QR codes in China. I mean, there is a lot of advantages in the Chinese systems. We tried similar thing in Europe, but the funny thing was that every incubation program that I was working with and was aware of in the last 6 months meanwhile, started to develop some Corona app. And I said, this just doesn't make sense. I mean, when you have thousands of Corona apps in the world, it doesn't measure anything. So Apple and Google, I think, united to put one system on the market. And I think this is also something that we should use in Europe, so that we use one system that we can really trace back the people. And this is the learning for me, for the European Union, that we need a little bit of centralization like China has to be successful in containing viruses. What's your opinion?
The app is actually the lesser of Europe's problems. I mean, the bigger of Europe's problem is that you can have SIM cards without an ID. Mm. How do you attract people if you don't have an ID? I mean, that's an objection, you know. I mean, when I first came to China, and until when was the last time I bought a SIM card which was not, which was a burner card that could be used without ID? It was probably 2012 or something. That was still existing in 2012, but now China doesn't allow burner phones. I mean, this is something, you know. And if you can't be taken. I mean, and if you want to track people with their phones, well, you need to be able to connect phones with people, and this is not easy, you know. And be it via an app or via QR code or something. So, and you know, now that you mentioned it, you know, another reason why China went back, insisted on the zero-case policy. I mean, I mentioned children education, all this, and so on and so forth. But something to think about: if you back to 0 cases, people take their mask off. If you take your mask off, the surveillance cameras look at you and they recognize you. But if you keep your mask, they might not. So there are so many surveillance cameras, you want them to work. If you're the Chinese government, you want them to work. You want them to provide you with useful information. And if everybody wears a mask, you get no information. So it's you know, it's very complicated, very complicated. There were very interesting comics, cartoons in some of the, very humorous in some of the European journals or papers, newspapers back in back in the day in June or something like this, and they actually nailed it. They understood that, oh, everybody wears a mask in China, but how about the cameras, you know? And yeah, they nailed it. That was a question. and you know, you put a mass surveillance system together based on facial recognition, and here comes the virus that gets everybody a mask on. What do? You know, how do you cope with that? I mean, that's the irony, you know. But I'm with you on centralization. I mean, calling for people to be reasonable. We know that a lot of people won't be reasonable because the European society is made of different groups of people, and you know, and freedom of opinion has been long advocated, obviously, and it's one of the positive aspects of the positive aspect of the continent, of course. But you know, today it has consequences, and it's also, you know, what do you want to do with your population, and how do you want to achieve, you know, the best results. And I'm going to be interested in looking a little bit better at how Sweden fares later on, especially during the winter, to see whether because this was an interesting move. This was a bold move on their end, and I remember their figures at first were bad, and then their figures were better, and now their figures are good. When it comes to China, right now our life is close to normal, except the big exception, which is we can't fly transcontinental, or we can fly transcontinental, but if we come back with a very serious guarantee, and well, so it doesn't make sense because it costs a lot and everything. But at the end of the day, I hope that governments at some point will be able to sit down and discuss those vaccine matters nicely, especially if we find out in the coming months that at least one of the vaccines being developed works. Because then we could, you know, set up a standard. There would be a global standard that say, okay, that's the kind of.
I think that's necessary. Yeah.
Then maybe through country-to-country cooperation or region-to-region cooperation, there would be licensing of the vaccine to players regionally, so that we are sure that it's the same vaccine produced everywhere, and that those vaccine makers will maybe not be as greedy as, you know, they thought they could be, because you know, it will have to remain affordable, just to make sure that the world goes back to normal quicker than expected. Because if countries fight against each other about vaccines,
it's not good.
We have a serious problem.
Yeah. Irénée, let's try to maybe we can speak endlessly. Let's try to sum it wrap up in 4 or 5 minutes. I completely agree to what you say. I mean, governments have to sit down and find a common solution so that we can unite again as a human race. There are a lot of good things in that. I think we have seen the Chinese situation, 0 cases, which is good, but with all the travel bans, it's quite challenging to maintain that. I think in Europe, we have another experiment to see how a society can live with the virus, and maybe they're happening 2 things. So maybe we find out that the virus is going away, like SARS-CoV-1, which would be very lucky for everybody.
It is not impossible. It is not impossible.
Or we can agree on a vaccine standard, which would be a good thing.
Vaccine standard if a vaccine works, or maybe, but I believe the vaccine might come from China earlier than the other ones.
Yeah.
But I believe if we find the drug will come from the West.
Yeah, I think we will get both.
That's my wrap up will be here. So, and vaccines and drugs, as you know and as everybody knows, are not competitors.
Yeah,
they have different uses, and they can be used in parallel together. You know, I mean, plus, even if they're the vaccine that works, it might not work for such a long time, and not everybody is eligible to vaccines. So we also need drugs for the kids, for the elderly, for a lot of people. So if at the end of the day, China comes with a vaccine that works and the West comes with a drug that works, maybe there's a way to make everybody work together again.
Yeah,
because China will need the drug and the West will need the vaccine.
It would be a great solution.
The best possible outcome, hopefully.
It would be a great solution, and at an affordable price, so that everybody can get the vaccine and everybody can get the drug, the therapeutics.
You know, given how much it costs to government right now just to make sure that their people don't die from unemployment, starvation, or not being able to pay their bills, as you say, everything will be more affordable than that. Anything will be more affordable than that. It costs so much. It costs so much, you know, right now, printing this money, because that's what we're doing, printing this money just to, you know,
I mean, to me,
put people afloat, maintain people afloat.
As you say, I mean, I like this picture of having a vaccine from China, which is not entirely developed in China anyways, because what's going on in the background is that on a scientific level, the whole world is working together to solve the problem.
Yes, and I strongly believe that in drug development, the West still has the edge. And in the vaccine development right now, it seems that China is a little bit ahead. Plus, you know, I know that the Russians have the vaccine out already, but you know, there might be the global trust issue here. But you know, hopefully those people can sit down, but this is going to take a lot of leadership. And it's really going to depend on when it is time to sit down and talk about this, who is going to be around the table.
Yeah. And I hope everybody...
But this is beyond us. This is beyond us and beyond me. But hope this session was informative to everyone.
Irénée, thank you very much for your time and for giving so much valuable information. Stay safe, and I wish all the best to you and your family.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you everybody who came online to listen. Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Please share the podcast and make sure you've subscribed. Have a great day.